So I know what you're seeing looks like some heavy pest damage, but actually this is damage just from a very light frost. And I wouldn't even say that it was a true frost. I just think with the morning temperatures dipping down so low below 35 that whenever the morning dew set in, that kind of crystallized enough to cause some pretty good damage to these squash. Now, these squash are actually large enough that this isn't going to devastate the plants. My biggest worry is that because of the damage, it might send off stress hormones, attracting squash bugs and things of that nature. We can see like the center leaves are still pretty good and have flowers forming, but even this leaf's kind of damaged. Now the flowers did okay. This one's naturally just kind of falling off because it already opened. But here are some further down that are not open and they're okay, but you can kind of see the leaves are a little bit translucent. So you can see kind of what happened was the cells of this plant, they have water in them, and then when they freeze, it causes some cellular damage, causes the plants to be translucent. Those cells die. So you can definitely tell where the frost damage was. Now, if you had less severe frost damage, your leaves may look something like this, and you may be tempted to think, oh, that's just pest damage, but it's actually frost damage from just the temperatures getting a bit lower, and we were not supposed to have a freeze. It's very rare that the temperature dips this low, this late in the year. I mean, it's only spring, but still, spring has started. We rarely get frost at this point, so I'm actually really surprised the temperature dipped that low. I didn't have anything to protect my plants, nor was I expecting it to get that cold. But luckily, there are 5 squash here, and they're all doing really well, other than, this frost damage on certain leaves, which you can just come through and clip these leaves off that have the damage to keep slugs and snails and other things from kind of feeding on that decaying material. And then here are some of the smaller plants. So this one's still going through the cycle. You can see it has a female squash flower right here that actually didn't get frost damage. So I'm really surprised with it being such a small fruit and the flower just starting to get to the point where it's going to open that it didn't damage. And you can see even some of the flowers, they were just fine. So it seemed like it was mostly the unprotected leaves that got the most damage from this cooler weather, and then everything else is fine. Now this is under my apple tree, and the apple tree's doing okay. So it's just kind of everything underneath it. The apple trees, the worst thing that can happen when a frost hits, if the blossoms are open, is usually it can cause the blossoms to drop or the immature fruit to drop. But apples are pretty frost hardy, except for this one is a Jerusalem apple. It only takes about 100 to 150 freeze hours for it to produce fruit. So if it would have had flowers, it would have probably damaged it and caused them to drop. But this is the one where the hurricane had cut off a bunch of limbs, so we haven't allowed it to make any spurs or have any fruit produce until all these limbs grow back. And so that's kind of been our main focus. And so I'm gonna go over to where the other squash plants are. So here's the smaller squash, and they've definitely had some damage. I've been coming through and picking off these flowers because they're not big enough to handle producing fruit. And if I let them do that, they're not going to develop as well as they should. And you can see these definitely had some frost damage. And while the damage isn't severe, the plants are so much smaller that it can impact them a lot more with a lot less damage. So I'm not sure how they're going to fare. Honestly, I might just have to start some new plants inside. But since I do have so many squash plants, there are 5 in the front bed. There are 9 right here, and these are all doing really well. These were some of the ones that I transplanted into individual cells, or up-potted into individual cells, so that they could grow and get larger, whereas these were planted directly from the smaller cells that these were in originally. So you can kind of see the difference that up-potting them once and keeping them under the grow lights for a couple more weeks really made for the plants, because they were all started about the same time. And so over here, these are pretty large too. So you've seen this bed a couple of times. This is our newer bed. Believe it or not that this bed is less than a month old. So it's pretty amazing just how much growth you can have in that time period. And in it we have all of our squash plants. And actually I don't really see any damage whatsoever on these, maybe a little bit there. But these actually came out pretty well. And here's a tiny bit on that leaf, but nothing really extreme. These must have trapped more heat because they're higher up off the ground. And they're mulched in really well. Now this is mulched in really well too, but it just didn't seem to work as well. I don't know if maybe the logs are trapping in heat or the fact that these plants are larger. And then they're interplanted with onions, and these are watermelon radishes. So there's actually quite a bit of food in this area. You can see there's still room to grow more stuff if we wanted to, but I don't want to because pretty soon these squash are going to be really large and they're kind of going to take over this whole area. And the potato, you didn't see there's like some branches missing because it did get some damage from that frost. Potatoes are not good in frost. Either are squash, but I found out that once they're a little larger, they're a bit more hardy. But if that would have been like a real frost, probably would have killed off everything. And it's crazy because I thought that we would end up getting squash over the weekend on Sunday, because it usually only takes 2 or 3 days for squash to mature, but because the temperatures dipped down so low, the squash that was pollinated did not do well. And then right behind me, all this lettuce, this is that Cimarron lettuce, it's gotten redder from the cold temperatures, and it's actually doing pretty well. I still haven't mulched it in because we weren't feeling particularly well and it was really wet. Now it's dry enough, I can go ahead and mulch all this in just to keep the topsoil from splashing up on the leaves of the lettuce, which is done in several areas. And although you could probably start harvesting some of these leaves for like baby greens, I really want them to get a bit larger. Now, some of these random plants in here, these are actually some watermelons that were planted in here with the idea that they'd probably take over right about the time that the lettuce was ready to harvest. So it's funny that such a warm weather crop didn't die back. One did, it looks right here by this lettuce, but they seem to fare pretty well. I'm actually kind of surprised because I thought of all things that would be what died. Now, here you can see we've kind of mulched in the pathway some more. And so this is how we like our pathways, so they're more accessible for our daughter to get through with her wheelchair, and it's just easier for us to walk through also. And then at the very back of this, if you wanted to, you could easily grow some melons or something and kind of let them trail over in the back. And also this live fencing. This fencing, I call it live fencing because if you look closely, it has both our grapevine and our blackberries growing across it. So it ended up being a really good trellis, and I use it to compost big leaves or hold wood before we have a chance to chip it down into mulch. And so here are the blackberry beds, and here is our 2 larger squash, and these were actually transplanted out just like 3 days before the ones in those log beds. But this compost has been aging for over a year now. It's mushroom compost, and I think that's improved the soil drastically. So you can see it did take some frost damage for sure, you know, on quite a few leaves. But underneath, it's still doing pretty well. All these other leaves made it really well, and it's still flowering and producing female flowers too. And then this one I thought for sure would be damaged because this was our fruit that if it wouldn't frosted, then it would have already produced a squash. So this was the first one that we pollinated, and now it's been almost a week and it hasn't produced fruit that was edible yet. It looks bigger in the camera than it is, but it's still pretty good size, and you can tell by the size of my hand that it's just not big enough to harvest quite yet. If our weather stays warm, then hopefully by this weekend. But if it would have been warm, instead of dipping down so low, then the fruit would have grown really quickly and been ready already. So there's still a bunch of flowers forming. So luckily we didn't lose our squash. You can see how sizable it's getting. These are bush squash, but bush squash still get, you know, upwards of 3 feet tall, and they spread out pretty large. And then all underneath here we have the turnips growing, and these are a fodder turnip, so they produce really good tops that you can use. You can see just how big they're. So while the weather got cool, these continued to grow, and they produce these massive leaves. There's a little bit of flea beetle damage, but it's not the end of the world. And it actually looks like some ants have made their way into my bed, and I actually see some right in here. They've made their way into the walkway at that over the weekend through the frosty weather. So I'm actually gonna take off my shoes because they're just covered in ants. That's no fun for anyone, and I didn't realize until they started biting me. So it's one thing when they're in the edge of the bed. It's another thing entirely when they've made their way into the walkway. That's definitely going to be an issue, because last thing I need is ants crawling up my daughter's wheelchair and onto her. That's definitely not cool. So I'm gonna have to figure out how to handle this. Usually when it gets this rainy, they start to move elsewhere, but I'm surprised they haven't. And so I think that pretty much covers most of the frost damage for the squash plants. I just kind of wanted to show that because I think a lot of people in our area that have experienced this really late frost probably think they should pull out all their plants, and I wouldn't. I would say always have extra plants available to transplant in case we do have a late frost. But you don't have to pull out your plants because they have this kind of damage. Really, you could just walk through and clip off these leaves and then compost them or feed them. Now the problem is you do risk squash bugs getting in to these areas when you pull off the leaves like that, because that's a pretty good hole. You could inject BT into your plants if that becomes the case. I'm just gonna wait and see what happens, to be really honest, because what's it going to hurt? If I pull them out, I don't get any squash, and if I leave them in and they do well, then at least I get some fruit. But if I leave them in and they get squash bugs, well, if I pulled them out, I wasn't gonna get fruit either way. So, you know, to me, it's worth the effort. And you can kind of see how I just walk over here and put it in. And if the ducks were out here ranging, I just throw it over to them. So there's a lot of options there. It's kind of like a good way for the permaculture design is that everything's interconnected. So for me, my garden area is right here. Composting bins are right there. There's another one right over here that we're going to turn into a worm farm, so we can also put leaves and food and things of that nature into them. And they'll eat it and break it down and turn it into soil, and plus we'll get worm castings on the top of the soil. And then, like I said, when the animals are over here, you know, things can be thrown to them. So it just makes it a really easy way to kind of connect everything. You know, things are so close together, and I really like that about it. It makes it a lot easier to kind of keep up with things and everything else. And then there is one thing I kind of want to cover. I see a lot of people like saying on the bigger channels where they see people feeding different leaves and stuff to their animals. They're like, oh, that's such a waste. You could have eaten that. Yes, you could have, but when you have an abundance as a homesteader or person growing, and you have animals and you want them to eat healthy, some of us actually grow extra food for our animals. And also, if you have an abundance, there's no reason why you shouldn't share with your animals. You know, give them a treat and nutrients and everything else. I'm not a big fan of just feeding them strictly grain feed. I think that, you know, their diet calls for a variety of food, and if I can grow that for them, and for one, not be dependent on a system and be able to provide nutrient dense food for my animals on my homestead, I'm absolutely going to do that. Plus, that's just a step towards being self-sufficient. So if you have an abundance and say you have Brussels sprouts, you want to feed the leaves to your animals, feed them to the animals. Are they edible? Yes, but there's nothing, you know, wrong with giving your animals good food. whenever we have an abundance of turnip leaves, I mean, I have 9-gallon bags in my freezer, not including what's in my fridge and in my garden. I absolutely am going to give some to my birds. That's the whole point of growing this much. So it provides for us and our animals. I think that's really important. So I'm just going to leave you with that closing thought, and checking out my carrots here that are also growing near my squash. They're doing pretty well. You can see how much greenery was produced during the cold weather. And so pretty soon they'll start producing more carrots. We've kind of come through. You can see this one's pretty good size right here, pushing up in the soil, and how well they've continued to grow despite the frost. So I definitely encourage you to interplant your stuff. So I think that's about all for today. I'm gonna go off, and now I'm feeling a little better. Maybe continue making a couple of garden beds with the new soil that we got and building everything up. That way, with warmer weather, we can kind of focus on transplanting maybe some melons, including cantaloupes. And also I have some Thai melons that the Thai tiger melons. And then also I want to get some okra and things of that nature started. I was really disappointed that I didn't start more potatoes, but after that light freeze came, I'm really grateful that I didn't. So that's what I'm going to be doing for the rest of the day, and I'll be sure to kind of film some parts of that so you can see the progress of it all. So once again, thank you for joining us, and I hope that everyone else fared the frost as good as we did.